347 people were standing in a field outside Lexington, Nebraska, on a Thursday afternoon in August of 2023, and most of them did not know Ruth Callaway's name. They knew Marcus Fielder's name. Marcus Fielder had been doing agricultural equipment demonstrations across a 12-county corridor in central Nebraska for 11 years, and he had built a specific reputation, not just for selling tractors, because plenty of men sell tractors, but for understanding that in 2023, selling an $80,000 machine to a Nebraska farmer required more than a spec sheet. It required theater. It required proof. It required bringing the machine to the farmer's ground and letting the farmer's hands go over it, and letting the farmer's eyes see what the GPS guidance system drew when it went to work in a field. Marcus understood demonstration. He understood how to let a number do his talking. He had driven 14 pieces of equipment into that field before 8:30 in the morning. Among them, 3 John Deere 6R series tractors in different configurations, 2 planter rigs, a spray unit, and the centerpiece. The one with its own banner, its own staging area, its own dedicated 15 minutes in Marcus's prepared presentation. A 2021 John Deere 6R 155. Demo unit, 214 hours on it. Listed at $82,500. More tractor than most of the men in that crowd had ever sat in, and exactly as much as Marcus needed to make the argument he had been making for 3 years about where central Nebraska farming was headed. The John Deere was green, that specific shade that a factory makes when it wants you to think of money well spent. Not the same green as the machine that came through the east gate of the demonstration grounds at 9:45 that morning. Marcus's green was precise and recent. The other green had earned its color over 6 decades outdoors. Ruth Callaway drove the Oliver through the gate without slowing for the registration attendant, because she had already registered 14 weeks earlier, and she had paid her $40 entry fee by check, drawn on the Callaway Farm account at Farmers State Bank in Lexington, and her confirmation had come back by mail, and she had a right to be in that field. The sign, zip-tied to the fence post near her designated staging area, read, "Blocking due to refusal of help." She had known the sign would be there. Someone on the fair committee had called her in late July to explain that Marcus Fielder had expressed concerns about the exhibition mix and had arranged professional equipment assistance for any participant whose machinery might benefit from technical support before the demonstration. Ruth had thanked the committee member for calling. She had said she did not need the assistance. The committee member had said she understood, and that the spot remained confirmed. She parked the Oliver and walked the pull course before 9 o'clock. The morning still cool enough that her breath was faint in the air, the ground giving slightly under her boots at one point near the far end of the lane where the previous night's irrigation runoff had softened the soil beneath the grass. She noted the cross slope at 90 feet. She noted where the surface changed character from packed to loose. She walked back to the Oliver and stood next to it for a moment, one hand on the front fender, looking at the ground. Then she started the engine. A 1962 diesel doesn't start the way a modern machine starts. There is no quiet, electronic wake, no refined low-frequency hum emerging from beneath a pressurized cab. A 1962 diesel starts the way something wakes up that has been asleep for a long time in a cold room. Reluctant at first, the compression cycles slow and effortful, the first attempt fighting itself. Ruth let it crank through the first cycle, felt it resist, let it crank again. On the third cycle, the injectors delivered fuel into cylinders that had finally reached temperature, and the engine caught. Rough for 1 second. Then 2. Then, on the third second, it found itself. All 6 cylinders in sequence, the mechanical injectors delivering fuel at exactly the pressure they had been calibrated to deliver. and the sound resolved from struggle into something lower and more certain. Not loud, not showy. The kind of sound that rises from the bottom of a thing, not the top. The crowd standing near Marcus Fielder's microphone stand, 200 yards across the field, heard it. Not everyone turned around, but the ones who turned around were the ones who knew what engine sounds were supposed to mean. Marcus kept talking. If this story already has you, hit the like right now. You have no idea how much that helps this channel grow. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe here, because there's a new story every week. Now tell me something. Did your father ever teach you something about a machine, a tractor, a truck, an engine, that you still use to this day? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. Now I need to stop here and tell you who Ruth Callaway is, because the Oliver doesn't make sense without her. And she doesn't make sense without Ray. Ruth Callaway was 34 years old in August of 2023. She lived at the house on County Road 740, 4 miles east of Lexington on the flat ground between the river and the railroad line. The same house her father, Ray Callaway, had bought in 1981 when he was 26 years old, with a commercial license, a Kenworth he was making payments on, and a clear idea of what his life was going to look like. The house sat on 40 acres, 30 in corn, 10 in pasture. Not enough land to farm full-time, and Ray had never intended it to be. He had been, all his life, a trucker who farmed. That distinction mattered to him. He was an owner-operator first, sole proprietor of Callaway Freight, running the same corridor between Lexington and North Platte for 30 years, hauling grain and ethanol and equipment and whatever needed moving in the 5-county zone he knew. He knew the roads by the way they felt under the tires at different times of year. He knew where the pavement went to gravel without warning and where the irrigation runoff crossed the highway in spring. He drove the W900 through seasons and decades until the odometer stopped meaning much because the frame of reference had shifted from miles to years. But in the spring and in the fall, Ray farmed. He planted his 30 acres and he harvested them himself, and he did not hire that work out. He did it on the Oliver. He had bought the Oliver at a Gosper County farm auction in April of 1988, standing in a field outside Elwood on a cold Tuesday morning, number 47, on a 62-item catalog. The machine had belonged to a farmer named Vern Hartley, who had run it from 1963 through the mid-'80s before buying a newer Case International and parking the Oliver in his equipment shed. It had sat there for 4 years. The paint was still honest. The tires held air. The engine turned over. Vern had run a short jumper cable to the battery the morning of the auction to demonstrate this, and the Oliver had started on the second compression cycle, which was enough for Ray. He paid $2,200 in cash. The nearest bid had stopped at $1,900. He drove the Oliver home on the county road that same afternoon, 71 miles without a trailer, because the April roads were clear, and if the machine moved, you moved it. He arrived after dark and parked it in the equipment shed, and stood next to it for a few minutes with the door open and the yard light on. The next morning, he started going through it. Ray spent the better part of that summer and fall doing what he did with every machine he owned, starting at the front and working to the back, checking everything twice before deciding what needed attention. The front spindle bearings needed replacement. The hydraulic pump ran at reduced efficiency, not failed, but working harder than it should have been, enough that the 3-point hitch raised slowly under a load. And the injection pump had developed an unevenness across the 6 elements. Not a misfire, not a stumble, but a slight inconsistency that a careful man could hear in the firing note at idle. A very slight arrhythmia in what should have been a perfect sequence. Ray was a careful man. He ordered the Oliver 1800 Series A service manual from a parts archive dealer in Iowa. It took 3 weeks to arrive. He ordered the calibration tool for the Rusa Master injection pump, a bench instrument specific to this engine, the kind of tool that most shops had owned once and sold off when the machines went out of production. From the same source. In October of 1988, on a Saturday morning with the equipment shed door open and the air carrying the first real smell of fall, he pulled the injection pump and took it to the workbench. Ruth was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket next to the bench. She was 3 years old. She would not remember this specifically, but Ray told her about it when she was older, more than once, and she recognized the workbench and the bucket from the telling. Ray calibrated the pump to factory specification and then adjusted it further, not far from spec, but enough, based on what he had learned listening to the engine over the previous 6 months. He set the fuel delivery rate by what the manual specified, and then he adjusted the timing by feel, turning the adjustment with his fingers, until the sound in his head matched the sound of the engine when he ran it up the following morning. He wrote one line in the green spiral logbook he kept in the Oliver's toolbox. Delivery adjusted per sound, not per spec. Engine will tell you if you're wrong. He wrote one more line 2 years later, after the first full planting season. She wants 1400 RPM under max load. Don't push past. Let her decide. The Oliver ran for the next 11 years without the pump being touched. Ray was not sentimental about machines. He did not name them or describe them as having personalities. What he believed, and he said this plainly the few times the subject came up, was that a machine responded to attention. Not affection, attention. You paid attention to what it told you, and it told you everything. He was usually talking about the W900 when he said it, but the philosophy crossed applications. Ruth drove the Oliver alone for the first time in the summer of 2001. She was 12. Ray stood at the edge of the field with a cup of coffee and watched her make 2 passes along the fence line. When she came back to where he was standing, he did not say anything for a moment. She asked if she had done it right. He said, "Did the engine sound right?" She said she thought so. He said, "Then you did it right. Go again." She went again. She helped him rebuild the injection pump the second time in March of 2007. The two of them on their backs in the equipment shed under a work light, Ray narrating and Ruth executing. He said, "Torque that fitting to feel. The spec is for someone who doesn't know this engine. You know this engine." She had torqued it to feel. The pump ran another 12 years. Ray died in March of 2019. He was 63 years old. He was on US 80 between Gothenburg and Kozad, returning empty from a delivery in North Platte, when his heart quit. The W900 coasted to the shoulder on its own. The grade was slight enough, and the road straight enough that the truck rolled 200 yards before stopping. Ruth drove 2 hours to reach him. She sat in the truck cab with him for a while, with the door open and the sound of the highway behind her. Then she had the W900 towed to a lot in Gothenburg and drove home in her pickup. The next morning she drove back to Gothenburg and brought the W900 home herself. She did not understand the full scope of what she had inherited, because Ray had managed the business side of Callaway Freight and Callaway Farm in his ledger, in his desk, in his head, and the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know was real. She spent the first 2 months learning to speak that language. The co-op debt was $31,400. The fuel accounts were in arrears. The property taxes were current. The equipment, both the W900 and the Oliver, was owned outright. No liens on either. Ray had never let a bank hold a note on anything that produced his income. She paid off the co-op debt in December of 2021 and did not celebrate. She wrote it in the margin of the monthly ledger page, the way Ray had written things in margins. In April of 2021, She pulled the Oliver's injection pump. She had been watching the engine for 2 seasons, listening for what she had heard Ray describe: an unevenness at low RPM under load. A very slight deviation from the even firing sequence she had known her whole life. She heard it in the spring of 2021, during the first field pass, and she recognized it. She parked the Oliver that evening. She got the service manual from the shed shelf where it had lived since 1988, the same copy Ray had ordered from Iowa, its spine cracked and its pages marked with his pencil notes. She got the calibration tool from the metal cabinet, still in the shop rag he had wrapped it in. She rebuilt the pump on a Saturday, alone, using Ray's notes and the sound of the engine as her reference points, adjusting 2 of the 6 elements that had drifted lean over the previous decade. She reinstalled the pump and started the engine and listened. Even. All 6. At idle and at 1 through 400 RPM, and at every point between. She wrote in the logbook, below Ray's last entry from March 2019, "Pump recalibrated April 2021. 2 elements adjusted lean. Engine sounds right." She closed the logbook and put it back under the oilskin in the toolbox. Now I can explain why none of that was sentimental. It was preparation. The 1962 Oliver 1800 Series A, with the naturally aspirated 6-cylinder diesel engine, carries a factory PTO rating of 82 horsepower. That is the number on the data plate. 82 horsepower in 2023 is a light-duty figure. The John Deere 6R155 that Marcus Fielder had staged at the front of his demonstration carried 155 horsepower at the PTO, nearly double the Oliver's rated output. Modern variable geometry turbocharger, electronic injection, the IVT, John Deere's infinitely variable transmission, which adjusts its ratio continuously to hold the engine at its most efficient operating point regardless of what the load is doing. A genuine engineering achievement, a machine that does things the 1962 Oliver was never designed to do. The 82 horsepower rating on the Oliver is accurate. It is measured at a specific RPM under controlled conditions. What it does not describe, what no rating number ever describes, is what happens at 1/400 RPM under a sustained heavy pull on a field where the conditions are not controlled. Here is what the story actually lives in. And I want you to understand this, because it is the reason the outcome was decided before Ruth backed the Oliver to the hitch. A naturally aspirated mechanical diesel engine builds its best torque at the bottom of its power curve. Not its peak torque, its sustained torque. The numbers on a comparison chart will always show a modern turbocharged machine winning at peak output. But a field pull is not a peak output competition. A field pull is a sustained output test. It asks a machine to maintain consistent force through an increasing resistance load over time. Through the 60 seconds it takes a weighted sled to transfer its ballast forward and press its skid plates into the dirt with the full weight of 12,000 pounds bearing down. The Oliver's 6-cylinder diesel, running at Ray's calibrated delivery setting, produces approximately 270 foot-pounds of torque at 1/400 RPM. Not its peak torque, its sustained torque at the specific RPM point where the injection pump was set to deliver full fuel. 270 foot-pounds, consistent, without interruption, for as long as there is diesel in the tank. The engine has no ECU calculating acceptable stress thresholds. It has no sensor network deciding when to protect the drivetrain. It has a mechanical injection pump calibrated by a man who spent 30 years learning one specific thing about one specific engine, and it delivers what it delivers, and it does not ask anyone's permission. The John Deere 6R155 has a genuine problem that lives inside its own decision-making. Modern tractors with IVT transmissions include a set of programmed protection parameters, Load thresholds at which the electronic control system reduces power output to prevent damage to the transmission and drivetrain. This is a real and useful feature in everyday operation. It extends the service life of components that cost between $12,000 and $20,000 to replace. In a production field scenario, the protection system is nearly transparent. Load conditions change gradually. The IVT adapts, the driver barely notices. But in a demonstration sled pull, on a temporary course with variable ground conditions that Marcus had not pre-surveyed, the load comes on faster and with less predictability than the system was calibrated for. The ECU sees the load spike. The ECU calculates the transmission stress. The ECU reduces power output to its calculated safe delivery threshold. And it holds it there. Not dramatically, not obviously, unless you are watching the right gauge. But the reduction is real, and it falls hardest at exactly the moment when the pull needs everything the machine has. The moment between 60 and 90 feet, where the sled ballast transfer is approaching its peak, and the resistance is maximum, and the gap between what the machine is physically capable of and what it is electronically permitted to deliver is widest. Marcus Fielder knew about the protection parameters. He had a legitimate answer for them, and the answer was true. The limits could be adjusted through a dealer diagnostic session, and in production field conditions, the power delivery was fully competitive. These were real statements. They described a different situation than the one he was standing in. Nobody had brought the diagnostic tool. Have you ever held on to something everyone told you to sell? The pull was proposed by Jerry Bates, who farmed 1,100 acres south of Lexington and had been standing at the fence since 9 o'clock watching Ruth go over the Oliver. Jerry was 61 years old. He had owned 3 Oliver tractors across his farming life and had sold all 3 in the late 90s when parts availability got thin and the economics pointed toward something newer. He had never stopped knowing what an Oliver engine sounded like. When the 1800 started up across the field that morning, Jerry had been in the middle of pouring a cup of coffee from his thermos, and he had stopped pouring and stood still for a moment. He watched Ruth walk the pull course. He watched her check the tires a second time. He watched her sit in the seat with both hands on the wheel and listen to the engine before she moved it. Somewhere around 10:30, standing with 3 other men near the fence line, he said, "I'd like to see what the old Oliver does against the new JD on a real pull." He said it at moderate volume, the way Nebraska farmers say things they've already decided are facts. It was the idea of the crowd before anyone could say it was his. Marcus heard it from near the John Deere's front axle. He was in conversation with a cattle farmer from Custer County, and the conversation had been going well. He looked across the field at the Oliver. He looked at the Deere. He thought about 155 horsepower. He thought about what it would mean for his sales conversation if the John Deere ran against a 1962 machine and performed as advertised. He said, "I think that's a great idea." He looked at Ruth. "If she's willing." Ruth looked at him from the seat of the Oliver. She said, "Which end of the sled?" Marcus said, "Lady's choice." She said first pull without hesitation, because she had been thinking about the ground since 6:45. The sled was the Dawson County Equipment Association's pull unit, 8,000 pounds of ballast in a welded steel frame, friction adjustable through a mechanical weight transfer system to a maximum effective resistance of 12,000 pounds. They set it at 8 for the first run. A county committee volunteer named Harold handled the connection pin. He was 74 years old and had grown up on an Oliver 88 in Phelps County, and when he set the pin in the hitch of the 1800 and looked up at Ruth, something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between the two. He checked the pin twice. He said, "She's on." Ruth settled into the seat. The Oliver's seat was not padded the way a modern tractor seat is padded. It was metal over a compressed rubber cushion that had been thin since approximately 1993, and Ruth's body had learned to read the machine through it. The vibration that came up through the pan at different RPMs. The slight list to the right, at low idle that had been there since the mid-90s, a structural variation in the frame weld that Ray had investigated twice and concluded was not worth correcting. She put both hands on the wheel. The steering had a real weight to it. No power assistance, direct mechanical linkage, the kind of system that gives you information back through your palms, whether you want it or not. She brought the throttle up to 100 RPM. The engine responded. The slow, idle drumbeat quickened. More urgent, still controlled. She held it there for several seconds, listening through the seat, through the platform under her boots, through the wheel. She was listening for the same things Ray had listened for before a hard run. All 6 cylinders even. Firing note clean. No hesitation in the bottom of the power stroke. Even. Clean. No hesitation. She put it in gear. The clutch engaged, single disc, dry, no assistance, requiring full commitment from her left leg. And the Oliver took the sled's weight and moved forward. The first 40 feet were unremarkable. The sled was dead weight on flat ground, and the engine handled it with ease, the RPM holding steady above 1,000, the sound ordered and unhurried. Somewhere at the back of the field, the ambient noise of 300 people was still present. Conversations, someone laughing, Marcus's voice carrying faintly from the direction of the staging area. The pull had not yet become a thing that required silence. At 43 feet, the sled's internal weight transfer engaged. It is a gradual mechanism. The ballast inside the frame slides forward as the sled is dragged, increasing the normal force on the skid plates, building the friction load from 8,000 pounds toward 12 over the following 30 or 40 feet. Ruth felt the resistance change come on. The engine felt it immediately after. The RPM dropped, down from 1,100 to 1,050 in the first second. Ruth did not change the throttle. Down to 1,000. Down to 950. She felt the crowd noise behind her change character, not silent yet, but lower, the way crowd noise lowers when people have decided collectively to pay attention. Down to 920. Down to 900. At 900 RPM, the sound of the Oliver changed quality. At 100 it had been ordered and purposeful. At 900 it was something harder. The firing note had developed a roughness that people who know diesel engines under load recognize as the sound of torque demand exceeding fuel delivery at that throttle and RPM point. Not a misfire, not a stumble. The sound of a machine working against more than it expected to find. The sound of every cylinder pushing harder than its comfortable range. The sound that most observers interpret as the beginning of the end. Ruth made no intervention. Down through 80-80, down through 860. Somewhere between 60 and 70 feet into the pull, the sled resistance was approaching its peak. The ballast transfer nearly complete. The skid plates pressed into the ground, with close to their maximum friction load. This was the point where drivers in machines like this one either found more throttle, or downshifted, or accepted that the run was over. Down through 840. The crowd at the back of the field had gone to a specific quiet that crowds only arrive at when they have made a collective decision that something is about to end, and they have not yet decided whether to be relieved or disappointed. She found it at 68 feet from the start line. Not dramatically. The way a door closes that has been slightly ajar. A small click, a resolution, a thing settling into its right position. At 1,400 RPM, the injection pump gave everything it had. Not everything it was rated for. Everything it had. Everything Ray Callaway had spent 30 years understanding, and had written down in one line in a green spiral logbook, "She wants 1400 RPM under max load. Don't push past. Let her decide." The RPM steadied. The sound changed. Not louder. Lower. More resolved. The roughness that had been in the firing note at 840 RPM, the arrhythmia of a diesel fighting a load it hadn't been asked for at that throttle, resolved into something even and purposeful, the way a draft animal finds its footing on steep ground and leans into the collar and simply goes. Not the edge of what the machine could do, the center of it, the place where its full calibrated delivery met the load it was carrying and found that the two were matched. The Oliver held its pace at 3 miles an hour, and it held the sled, and it moved. It did not surge. It did not accelerate. It moved with the specific quality of something that is not near its limit, but at its center. And the crowd at the back of the field heard the engine change, and the ones who knew what it meant understood before the tractor had covered another 10 feet, and the ones who didn't know what it meant looked at the ones who did and understood something was happening. Ruth made the slight left correction she had planned at 68 feet, a small steering input to account for the cross slope she had read that morning. And the line held true. The sled moved. The pull ran another 59 feet at 1400 RPM. The resistance at maximum. The Oliver holding its pace with the same steadiness through foot 50 as through foot 60, through 70, through 80, through the measured and unremarkable persistence of a machine that had been asked to give everything and was giving it without drama. At 126 feet, the cross slope she had noted at 90 shifted the traction load unevenly between the rear tires, and the left rear broke free. The pull ended. 127 feet. Harold said it in his plain voice, loud enough for 30 people to hear. He did not editorialize. There was silence for approximately 4 seconds. Not theater quiet. Not polite quiet. The silence of 300 people who have seen something they did not expect to see, and who have not yet decided what language to put on it. Tyler ran the John Deere 16 minutes later. Tyler was Marcus's demonstrator. 3 years on this equipment line, factory certified, skilled in the way that men are skilled when they have been trained well on good machines. He backed the Deere to the hitch with precision and without hesitation. The connection was made. The crowd had reorganized. Some people had moved toward the track. Some had found higher ground near the fence. A number of them were filming. The John Deere's engine startup was nearly inaudible from the fence line. The IVT brought the machine up to operating condition through a brief electronic check sequence, the turbocharged engine running at low idle with the refined and managed sound of something that had been engineered to be unobtrusive, to make its power available without demanding attention. Not an objectionable sound. Simply the sound of a different philosophy about what a working machine should be. The first 80 feet went as Marcus had advertised. The IVT held the power band steady through the load buildup without any input from Tyler. The GPS guidance system drew a mathematically straight line. The traction management system shifted weight between axles in response to the ground. Everything on the spec sheet was present and working. At 82 feet, the sled resistance reached the load threshold Marcus had not surveyed for. The ECU registered a stress value on the IVT output shaft that exceeded the protection parameter. The response was immediate and automatic and very small, a reduction of approximately 11% of rated power. Tyler felt the hesitation in his seat. He increased the throttle. The ECU registered the increased throttle input and the current transmission stress and the load sensor values and calculated its safe delivery. The calculation returned 92% of rated output. Tyler pushed the throttle harder. The ECU calculated again, 92%. The deer continued to pull. 92% of 155 horsepower is not nothing. The sled moved. Tyler was skilled, and he kept the line, and he held the pull through the increasing resistance, and the machine did what it was permitted to do by the system that was protecting it from what it could actually do. It moved the sled to 118 feet before the same cross slope broke traction. Harold said, 118. 2 words, 9 feet short. Marcus Fielder was standing near the front of the John Deere, his hand resting on the hood, when he heard that number. He had been watching Tyler's pull with the particular attention of a man who needs the next piece of information to be the one he expected. He heard the number and he stood still for a moment, his hand on the green metal, looking at the pull track. The crowd noise that followed was not the silence of surprise. That silence had already been used on the Oliver's pull. What the crowd made now was a lower sound, the sound of confirmation, of something privately suspected becoming publicly true, of the understanding that the $247 in the pocket of the argument had just been spent. Marcus did not pick up the microphone for a while. He walked across the field to where Ruth had parked the Oliver after driving it back from the pull course. She was off the seat, standing on the left running board, checking the oil level on the engine's dipstick. He walked up to the front of the tractor and stood at the left rear wheel for a moment, looking at the machine. Not at Ruth, at the Oliver, at the faded green paint on the hood corners, at the exhaust stack above the engine, at the Oliver badge on the grill, original equipment, 61 years old, still legible. He looked at it for a few seconds. He said, "What year?" Ruth said, 62. He nodded once. The kind of nod that is not agreement and not surrender, but that comes from a place that is honest. The nod of a man who has spent 11 years selling equipment and who has enough of himself intact to recognize when a machine has said something that cannot be unsaid. He walked back toward the staging area without another word. Jerry Bates appeared at the Oliver's left side about 15 minutes after that, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the co-op's booth at the edge of the grounds. He handed Ruth one without asking if she wanted it. She took it the same way, not as an offer accepted, but as a fact received. They stood next to the Oliver and drank their coffee. Jerry said, "Your father run this tractor?" Ruth said, "Since '88. He looked at the fender panel, at the white lettering that had faded to the color of old cream. "Callaway Farm." He was quiet for a moment. "Ray Callaway. I think he hauled grain out of the Phelps County Co-op, early '90s, season or 2. Ruth wrapped both hands around the cup. "That sounds right." "He took care of his stuff," Jerry said. Ruth looked at the Oliver's hood, at the stack, at the engine cover that had been lifted and replaced more times than she could count. "He's gone," she said. "The tractor isn't." Jerry finished his coffee. He stood there another moment, looking at the Oliver the way old farmers look at old machines, not with nostalgia exactly, but with a kind of respect that comes from knowing what years of work looks like when it's been preserved. Then he walked back toward the main field. Ruth waited until most of the crowd had moved on to the afternoon portion of Marcus's demonstration before she opened the toolbox on the left running board. She lifted the oilskin. She took out the green spiral logbook and held it for a moment without opening it. Then she opened it to the first page Ray had written on. May of 1988, the first field pass, his handwriting recording the engine hours and the field conditions, and a single line about how the Oliver had run clean through the whole morning without complaint. She read the entry. Not for the information. She had the information. She read it for the particular weight of his hand on the paper, the economy of what he had written and what he had not written. She closed the logbook. She put it back under the oilskin. She closed the toolbox. She checked the left rear tire the same way she had checked it that morning. Thumb pressed into the sidewall, reading what was there. It told her what it was. She started the Oliver for the drive back to the trailer. The engine caught on the third compression cycle, the same as the morning. Rough for a second. Then, finding itself, all 6 cylinders in sequence. The timing Ray had set, and she had maintained. The sound of something that had been asked to do a specific thing, and had done it, and was ready to do it again. She drove out through the east gate without stopping. In November of 2023, Marcus Fielder called the Dawson County Fair Committee about the following year's demonstration slot. He spoke with the committee chair for 10 minutes about logistics and timing and what equipment he planned to bring. Near the end of the call, the chair mentioned that registration for the open exhibition was filling up. More families than last year, she said. A lot of calls after the August event from people interested in bringing older equipment to show. She mentioned the Callaway Farm registration for the 1962 Oliver was already in. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said he understood. Then, before he ended the call, he said, "What does she run in the engine? On the Oliver?" The committee chair said she didn't know. Marcus said he understood, and he thanked her, and he hung up. The Oliver is on County Road 740 right now, outside Lexington, Nebraska. The 40 acres behind the house are going to corn again this spring, the same acres Ray planted for 30 years, along the same fence lines, between the same fields that have absorbed 35 springs of that engine working at 1,400 RPM when the soil is wet and the work requires everything the machine has. The green spiral logbook is in the toolbox under the oilskin. The last written entry is Ruth's from April 2021. The entry above hers is Ray's from March of 2019, 8 days before he died. A note about spring field prep, and a reminder to check the front spindle bearings before planting. She hasn't checked them yet. She'll check them in April. The name on the fender still says Callaway Farm. Ruth hasn't repainted it. She doesn't intend to. The letters are faded to the color of old cream. They are still readable. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I want to hear from you. What's the thing you kept when everyone told you to let it go? The machine, the land, the name on the side of something that was worth keeping. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. The Oliver is still running.